The kind of delightful, charming image of the mermaid that we may have now is very different from the medieval idea of the mermaid, which is she evolved out of the ancient figure of the siren, who was actually half woman, half bird, and was a very fearsome figure and associated with danger and not seductive in the way that the mermaid later became.
Welcome to the Research and Reason podcast. Join us as we discuss the latest research, news, and opinion from arts academics at the University of Auckland.
Kia ora koutou, ko Julianne Evans aho. I'm Julianne Evans, the Media Advisor for the Faculty of Arts. And my guest today is Kim Phillips, a professor in history who specialises in gender, sexuality and women in the medieval period. Tēnā koe, Kim. Lovely to have you here.
Tēnā koe, Julianne. Thanks for having me.
I think the last time that we spoke might have been around the time of your inaugural lecture, where you were talking about mermaids and their depictions in art and culture throughout the medieval period, perhaps right up to the Renaissance, which seems to be a perennially fascinating topic for everybody. And I think it still fascinates you because you are thinking about another project which has the working title, book project, of Mermaids, Milkmaids, Nursemaids, Hags, Women, Breasts and Embodiment in Late Medieval England. Fascinating title. Tell us about it.
Thank you. Oh, thanks, Julianne. Well, the book it's had quite a long gestation. So I've been thinking about medieval women and the body for many years, and thinking about medieval breasts in particular. So the meanings that attach to women's breasts in the medieval period and how they were different from modern contexts or from other global contexts in the present. And so I'm thinking about the breast as erotic, as nurturing, as a source of income, as associated with healing, and also as something that's subject to disease and ill health. So I've been working on that bit by bit over several years, and I could never quite get it done. And I think my discomfort was that I was treating the breast as an object, even though, in the past, in the medieval past, and that seemed to me to be kind of re-objectifying a body part that is subject to far too much objectification already in our own society. So I wanted to think about my topic, but in relation to the women who lived in the Middle Ages and the imagery that surrounded them, and that has actually influenced subsequent images of women, so kind of iconic types of women. So my original format kind of stayed largely in place, but it changed so that the full woman was involved. So the erotic breast came in my mind to be associated with the mermaid, and that's something that, as you said, I'd already started working on. The nurturing breast is associated with, of course, the nursemaid or the wet nurse. And then the ailing or the kind of reviled, aging breast is associated with the hag. I also brought in dairymaids or milkmaids because I got interested in women as involved in the dairy industry, or industry is not quite the right word, but dairy production in the Middle Ages, and the fact that they tended to milk the cows and to make the butter and cheese that was so central to their survival in mostly rural societies. So it just kind of all came together with these four archetypes, and it struck me that they also have a really long life in European popular culture. So the book that I'm working on, I'm hoping that each chapter will start with a quite well-known kind of archetypal image of each type of woman. So the mermaid, I'm thinking, will be Disney's Ariel, because everyone knows her. If you say Disney's Ariel, everyone's got a mental image of her and they know something probably about her personality and what she has meant to particularly young girls and women in our own day. For the milkmaids, I'm thinking of the literary character Tess of the D'Urbervilles from Thomas Hardy's novel. She was a milkmaid only for part of the novel, but I think the imagery of purity and corruption, and that kind of, those two things are always really combined in the milkmaid. And I think it's to do with milk being a pure product that quickly goes off.
So that's interesting.
Yeah, so that imagery of purity and danger, or purity and pollution, I think is really interesting to explore.
And what about the hag?
Well, the
plenty of choices, I'm sure.
Yes, well,
Witches
the nurses, I'm going to do Shakespeare's nurse, I think. But the hag, I'm still trying to think of the right example. So if you've got any ideas for a really archetypal hag that everyone thinks of when they think of the hag as an individual figure, I've got a few ideas, but a couple of them are from Disney. I've already got a Disney character.
Yeah, it depends what you're sort of meaning, because hag,
yes.
of course, is a horrible derogatory expression in lots of ways, isn't it? You know, we use it in the same way as we'd say old bat or
That's
old,
right. Yeah.
you know, old biddy and all the rest of it. And so, you know, there's a whole... there's part of me thinking I don't even want to refer to someone as a hag, but I suppose do you mean a sort of a wizened up old lady who's not very nice to people? Is that essentially the thing?
That's the kind of archetypal image of the hag. A more kind version of it would be the crone. So someone who has the same kind of wizened appearance but is kindly and wise and uses their experience for good. So the hag and the crone are kind of two sides of the same coin, I think, in our culture. But I'll probably go with the hag. So I'm still trying to think of a good example.
Does that word come from medieval times?
That's
hag?
another thing that I still need to examine. I think it probably does. The hag chapter is the one I haven't done any work on yet. I've done a lot on the mermaids and young kind of nubile women, if you like. A lot on milkmaids and a lot on nurses, wet nurses, and women who breastfed their babies.
Where are you getting the information from mostly? What are your sources?
It's a real mixture. So what I'm writing is a blend of cultural and social history. So I am interested in the literary and artistic imagery surrounding those four types as it existed in the Middle Ages. And there's plenty to go on. There's many images of mermaids, for example.
Sculptures and churches, all sorts,
carvings, stone carvings, wooden carvings, a lot of manuscript illuminations. So there's no shortage of imagery, and there's literary or theological descriptions as well, because the kind of delightful, charming image of the mermaid that we may have now is very different from the medieval idea of the mermaid, which is she evolved out of the ancient figure of the siren, who was actually half woman, half bird, and was a very fearsome figure and associated with danger and not seductive in the way that the mermaid later became. So by the late Middle Ages, the siren, the bird woman, had turned into the fish woman, the mermaid.
With the mirror and the comb.
That's right, yeah. So, and had become symbolic of sins of lechery and pride, looking in the mirror, looking at yourself, vanity. But was portrayed with all the characteristics that were associated with beauty in the late Middle Ages. So the long flowing blonde hair, the youthful pretty face, the slim body, small perky breasts, and so on. So there's a lot to go on there. You think about what's the social history content there. Obviously there weren't any mermaids for me to explore the social history of, but I'll look at young women and how they, as far as I can tell, felt about their bodies and themselves as sexual beings. And there's a little bit that I can go on there in terms of cosmetic recipes that they use to change their or enhance their appearance. In terms of the others, there's so much material. There's a lot of sources that I can use that take us into the world of medieval wet nurses. In fact, that's something I'm working on at the moment. I'm looking at all the wet nurses of the English royal families from the 12th to early 16th century, and I've been able to identify somewhere between 65 and 70 individual women who worked as wet nurses in royal households, and you can identify them through financial records associated with royalty. So they really, the kings and princes of the day really valued their old nurses and paid them, not only at the time their parents paid them at the time that they were nursing, but then subsequently, and sometimes for decades afterwards,
kept them on, did they?
They would pay them. Often they wouldn't. They might keep them within the household, but more usually they would go off and live their lives. But the royal treasury would pay them a really healthy pension to live a very comfortable life. So that relationship, I think, was often closer than the relationship of the princes and princesses with their own biological parents, because the mother in the royal context didn't normally nurse her own child or even have that much to do with them while they were young children.
Was that because they didn't want to spoil their beauty, or it just wasn't something they thought that was beneath them to do?
Yeah,
that?
I think both of those things. I think there's definitely a notion that the more elite you are, the less likely you are to breastfeed your own child. But also queens were travelling a lot and away from their children a lot, on royal business or their own business. So they simply weren't around. They didn't spend that much time in the company of their children in many cases. So I think it's a combination of kind of cultural factors and practical ones. And yeah, I think they're in court. They can't just breastfeed their baby at court. So
it's very interesting how that whole thing has changed now to the point where if you don't breastfeed your child, you're considered to be, somehow not serving them well and not giving them the best start. I don't think we really have wet nurses so much anymore, do we?
No. But that idea that you should breastfeed your own babies actually existed in the Middle Ages as well. And if you read the works of theologians, people who wrote sermons, that kind of thing, they were always scolding mothers and saying you shouldn't give your children out to wet nurses. They'll, because the milk was thought to be a product of the blood, and it was the same. That's a kind of lesson in medieval biology that we probably don't really need to go into, but the blood that was thought to nurture the fetus in the womb was understood to be the same substance as that went into the breasts afterwards and became the milk. So it was considered best to breastfeed your own child because it's part of maintaining a lineage. Just as having your own child is part of maintaining.
But they didn't anyway, did they?
But they didn't. They just ignored it.
Yeah,
because they had other things to do, or it was
probably
considered
inconvenient.
beneath them. Yeah, so a real mixture of things. So I'm interested in. I've looked a lot at the royal wet nurses because there's a lot of records of them, but I've also looked at wet nurses among the nobility. They also frequently use them, though not universally. And I'm trying my best to find sources for wet nurses further down the social scale as well, because I'm interested to know how widespread wet nursing was. It's not really possible to do quantitative analysis, but even getting a whole lot of anecdotal bits of evidence, mostly from things like court cases or financial records of different kinds, where I can pick up that kind of information.
Very fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
How about the milkmaids? Is that the whole Tess of the D'Urbervilles thing? I think is so interesting because her tragedy seems to be that she just was sort of the victim of terrible, acts of fate where, one thing just happened wrongly for her and then in the end it all fell apart. But actually there were deeper, darker themes there as well, weren't there, of her downfall. And it seemed to be to do with her beauty.
That's right.
Largely.
Yes. Yes, and I think that's why Hardy chose being a milkmaid as one of her jobs that she did. And actually when she meets the man that she falls in love with,
her
Angel
seducer.
Clare.
Oh, no, Angel Clare.
Oh, yeah,
yes.
after the seduction, the man who she fell in love with and betrayed her, but then they came back together later. They're actually milking together in a milking shed. So Hardy obviously hasn't chosen that randomly. He finds that a fertile image to draw upon. And he had some other, there's a short story, it's called the Duke and the Mermaid or something like that. Sorry, the Duke and the milkmaid. Get my different maids mixed up. And he's got a poem as well about a milkmaid. So it's an image that he's drawn to, and I think, it's that Victorian tension around femininity and, the desiring the beautiful young woman, but also all of that anxiety about her sexual purity and how fragile it is and how easily it
can be spoiled.
It can be spoiled like milk going off. So I think that's why he's chosen the milkmaid.
So you're ranging beyond the medieval period there into the 19th century, aren't you? Or,
So I think I said earlier that I'm hoping that each chapter will begin with an iconographic version of each type. So I've got Disney's Ariel to be the mermaid, and she's so radically different, not in appearance but in personality, from medieval understandings of the mermaid. So I find that interesting.
And she herself is based on Hans Christian Andersen's
That's right.
Little Mermaid, isn't she?
Yes, but with all the really sad, awful, tragic parts of the story taken out, it's made kind of charming and playful and much more palatable for a family or audience of children. So yes, Tess, as I've said, going into the 19th century. For the wet nurse or the nursemaid, I'm thinking Shakespeare's nurse from Romeo and Juliet,
which takes Renaissance times, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think it might be set in the Middle Ages, but it was written in the late 16th century. But that's a very, if you've seen the play or read it or studied it, she's a really important figure actually in the play.
She's a lovely character.
Yeah, she and Juliet have this incredibly strong bond because presumably she nursed Juliet when Juliet was a baby, but stayed on in the home and remained her nanny, her nurse in a non-breastfeeding sense.
And her advocate as well, really,
that's
and her
right.
carer.
Yes, and the mother is quite distant and
cold,
aloof and cold, and the really warm relationship is between Juliet and the nurse, and that to me is something that I also see in some of those medieval records of relationships between wet nurses and even future kings and princes and princesses in the Middle Ages. So that struck me as interesting.
Would the hag, does the hag have to be unattractive, or could the hag be, because I suppose you could go into the stepmother and the nasty sort of Cinderella stepmother who doesn't have anyone's best interests at heart except her own, and is definitely older but very manipulative and cunning, but also sort of rather attractive in a way. Yes,
kind of attractive in a kind of almost post-sexual way, that she's kind of a post-menopausal woman who's very elegant, but not likely to be the object of heteronormative desire, I would suggest, at least in the way that she's portrayed in
it's very complex culture. That one. You've got your work cut out.
Yes, So I'll keep working on it.
Yes,
and I welcome
fascinating.
I welcome suggestions.
Oh well, maybe we've got people who are listening who might have their ideas about what a hag ought to be and reclaiming the whole thing. Because Power is sometimes part of it, isn't it? And witches,
Yes.
they can be part of
That's
the idea
right.
of a hag.
Yeah, and having a power that people are frightened of.
And that's separate to men and
Yes.
unrelated to male power.
Yes, because the men don't desire them. They don't find them sexually attractive.
So they're free. in
So
a way.
they're free, which makes them all the more disturbing. Yeah.
And I suppose mermaids as well lived in their own realm.
That's right.
Under the sea,
Yes.
presumably. And maybe they did have, male power under there in the form of the king of, the father or whatever. But they seem quite free in their way as well,
Yes.
and quite threatening from that point of view,
That's
perhaps.
right. Yes, and medieval imagery of the mermaid, as I said, is very different from that modern kind of playful image. The mermaid was a figure to be afraid of and represented certain kinds of sin that you could go to hell for. So, and she could also lead a man into sin, which is probably even worse, because she's enticing with her song and her long blonde hair kind of flowing in the water,
And her breasts are always exposed, aren't they?
yes, they are
Which is another thing if
in
you think
medieval
about
art. Yeah, of course.
coming back to your other subject.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, the upper torso, which is the part that is out above the water when she's sighted, is this alluring sight, but it's hazardous to your poor innocent man who
Your
is
sailor.
entranced by her song and her beauty.
All very interesting stuff. Just thinking about what all of those things have in common, it seems to be this whole idea of women being valued for how they look, for how their relationship to men as well, or not, and how we still are struggling with all of those ideas. And some of those ideas of perfect beauty come to us from the medieval times onwards, don't they?
They do, actually. Yeah. If you look at medieval images of the perfect woman, she has a lot of characteristics that you'll see in a Vogue cover model or a catwalk model. She's kind of long and slender with flowing hair, usually blonde, blue-eyed, dainty-featured, always slim, white skin as well. So it's a very Northern European ideal of beauty that I think, despite our globalised world, is still quite dominant, even today. But it's interesting that we do see that ideal in the Middle Ages, but that's not to say that ideals of women's beauty never change. And they are subject to historical change and construction depending on the values of the day and the different priorities of people at given times. Something that interests me about the Middle Ages is women's beauty doesn't seem to have been particularly focused on. It wasn't really of great interest in the early Middle Ages, so up to about the 12th century. When women were praised, it was for their personal qualities, their morality, their leadership, and their clothing and their jewellery might be praised, but not their body or their face or their hair. You really look in vain for that kind of detailed imagery. So that's quite an interesting shift that's going on around the 12th century that I'm hoping to explore.
Yeah, and we're still talking about women's beauty today.
Yeah, we just don't seem to be able to get away from it.
We can't get away from it.
And of course now it's big business.
Oh, it really is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Look, lovely talking to you, Kim. Thank you very much, and I look forward to reading that book.
I look forward to it being written.
You've been listening to the Research and Reason podcast. Stay up to date with the Faculty of Arts by following us on social media.